Welcome, everyone. This is a lecture I've been looking forward to all year. I'm super excited about Bryan Lee joining us today. He is in quite a lot of demand these days, and so we're lucky to have you with us, Bryan. My comments will be short. I'll hand it off to Caddy for the intro, but I just want to welcome everybody again to a talk within our 50th anniversary lecture series as we reflect on the last 5 decades of architecture and also look forward to the next 5. I would like to make a special thank you to LS3P for their sponsorship of today's talk, as well as AIA Charlotte for their continued support of our lecture series. And with that, I will hand it over to Caddy.
All right, thank you, Blaine, and welcome everyone to today's lecture. I'm very honored to be introducing today's speaker, Mr. Bryan Lee, an architect, writer, educator, activist, and organizer focusing on design justice. He's the New Orleans-based design principal of Colloqate Design, a nonprofit multidisciplinary design practice dedicated to expanding community access to design and giving other people and practices the tools to pursue design justice themselves. Mr. Lee is the founding co-organizer of the Design as Protest Collective. He was recognized as one of the 2018 Fast Company Most Creative People, a USC Annenberg Civic Media Fellow. In 2019, Colloqate received the Architectural League's Emerging Voices Award, and in 2021, it was named the National Design Award winner in the Emerging Designer category by Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian Design Museum in New York. He has led 2 award-winning architecture and design programs for high school students through the Arts Council of New Orleans and the National Organization of Minority Architects, spreading the reach of Colloqate's mission for generations to come. Centering on people and place, and through programming, planning, and design projects, Mr. Lee seeks to dismantle the privilege and power structures that use the design professions to maintain systems of injustice. The work he leads at Colloqate manifests radical visions for what living in space with one another means. In a recent Q+A with Terry Peters for the Architect magazine, Lee stated that in the next 5 to 10 years, we'll start to see the aesthetic correlation between design justice and what we call colloquial architecture, just like you saw the change in the aesthetics of place as byproducts of the environmental movement 20 to 30 years ago. At this challenging yet hopeful moment, we're very excited and fortunate to have the opportunity today to learn and to discuss concepts and principles of design justice that Mr. Lee has been working on throughout his career. And with that, please join me welcoming Bryan Lee.
Thank you. I said that, Caddy? I said those words? Okay.
That's what I read on the website.
Cool, I dig it. All right, well, I'll give a presentation today then, I guess, and we'll start with the kind of overarching frame. But before I do that, thank you again for inviting me to speak with you today. This is, as you know, an extreme passion of mine to kind of proselytize design justice. It is something that we've built from ground up, and thinking about what spatial design justice can apply to our overall profession and to the people that we serve, more importantly, is really why I'm here. So I want to start by just kind of anchoring a few core principles and maybe just a little bit of a story about where I'm from. So I'm from Trenton, New Jersey, and my grandmother lived in a house on Mulberry Street in Trenton, New Jersey. My other grandmother, as I just mentioned, is from Greensboro, North Carolina. And between the two of them, what I recognized at a very early age was the value and the value of home, the value of home as a collective endeavor. It's not simply a place for individual respite, but a place for families to grow, to learn about one another, to protect one another, and to share, right? And so when I was very young, I was a military brat. I moved from place to place. I lived in Sicily for a little while and came back to Trenton, New Jersey. I lived with my grandmother in that house on Mulberry Street. And I remember her walking up and down the stairs over and over and over again, and her always being in pain going up and down those stairs. And I remember asking my parents, what does it mean to actually think about a space and design a space that doesn't hurt this person that I loved so much, loved so dearly? And they said, that's being an architect. That's something that you can anchor and move towards in your life if that's something you want to do. So that became the kind of impetus for my trajectory. It wasn't rooted in a necessary interest in art, although I was an artist. It wasn't rooted in crafting or building, although I was a crafter and a builder at a young age. It was rooted in, how do we create something that serves the purpose of elevating the lives of people we care about, the people who are beloved in our lives? And so that's what Colloqate was born from. Over many, many years, that concept, that idea drove into all forms and spaces within our work and shaped the kind of core definition of Colloqate. It's a lot of words here, but just to the point, Colloqate is a combination of two words, colloquial and locate, or location, right? So the sophisticatedly informal use of formal language, right? Colloquial, of a place, locate. And so how do we think about the language of places, especially those places that are historically marginalized and disinherited? The informalness of those languages are what's key, and they can be extrapolated from the visual language of a place, the aesthetic, the architectural, and the verbal language of a place. All of those things are important in the context of thinking about the design of neighborhoods and communities. And so Colloqate is geared towards understanding that it is the sequences of people and place habitually juxtaposed at a greater frequency than chance. So the three meta profiles of principles that you can anchor, or that you can sit with in this work: power, values, and care. Power, the history of all revolutions is based in blood and land. This is a summary of the message to the grassroots from Malcolm X. And he talks about the landless versus the landlord, right? He talks about the power imbalance between those who own property, who can stake a claim in the land, and those who are subject to the power of those who own that land, right? And the forever battle between those two ends of the spectrum. The second is recognizing values. So those with power have a set of values. Those who have a different type of power also have a set of values. And there's a constant struggle to define how those values are monumentalized in our physical environment. And so if we can acknowledge that, we can acknowledge that our collective values then are validated through the spaces and places that we design. And so if a racist system is what is proliferate in our society, then a racist system will create monuments to the hubris of white supremacy and the violence of white supremacy through the physical environment. So how do we acknowledge those systems and how they are placing various monuments, from markers to museums left in our landscape? And then care. We talk about design justice as a means to understand that design justice is what love looks like in public spaces. Now, this is cribbed from Dr. Cornel West, where he says justice is what love looks like in public. The intention is here to understand that spatial design justice is a deep reflection of care for a beloved community, expressed through physical form. And when I say a beloved community, when I say express, or an expression of care for a beloved community, what I really mean is that in order for you to show or express or believe in a care for a beloved community, you have to be in community with people. It's not enough to be superficial or transactional and hope that the architecture we produce from that transaction is relevant or sustaining to that community. And so what do you do when it's not transactional? How are you connected to those communities when it's not just simply about the things that you need? Will define whether or not your architecture can be a sustaining factor for communities long term. So all of that to say, we believe that for nearly every injustice in the world, there is an architecture, a plan, a design that sustains it, right? whether that is the prison industrial complex. We know that the amount of prisons that were built from 1970 to 1995 blew up by 300 to 400%. The amount of overall square footage of the prison population, or I'm sorry, prisons and jails is more than there ever was plantations in the South. That means that the amount of labor is equal to that. So the things that we do and that we believe in are, we create systems to amplify or dampen them, and our choice there is the important one, which way we decide to move our work. So design justice then asks us to forward a radical, anti-racist, liberatory vision of racial, social, and cultural reparation through the process and outcomes of design. I say this very specifically because there are oftentimes in design justice, there are a lot of people who attempt to maybe de-radicalize or neuter this set of sentences. When we designed spatial design justice, over a little over a decade ago, this was the core of the ask, right? So it is radical. And often people see radical as an extreme or two sets of an extreme, but radical is actually, the etymology is radish. It means to get to the root of an issue, the root bulb, right? So it's not extreme, it's depth, right? Understanding a problem at its core before you start to address it. If you don't understand it at its core, then you stay superficial and you create more problems than solutions out of that. I say reparation because every act of building, of creation, requires some dismantling. And so there's an act of immediate healing that you're attempting to do, an acute healing based on a singular project. But reparation, thinking about reparation in the longer sense, what does it mean to address historical injustices in a particular community by way of the work that we do, whether that's, again, architecture proper, whether that's planning, whether that's design at a much more regional scale. All of those things have been influenced by racial, social, cultural biases and prejudices. And so we seek to repair those in the work in some capacity. Does that mean that we can solve any of it in one fell swoop in one project? No, but we should play our part. Right? And then lastly, it says process and outcomes of design. Through the process and outcomes of design, we are societally focused on aesthetic. We are societally focused on the outcomes oftentimes. And that forces us to neglect processes that are just, that are equitable, that are liberatory in nature. And so when I say process and outcomes of design, they are inextricably linked. When we seek an outcome, we must understand that the depth and veracity of the process will determine whether or not that outcome is successful, whether or not the architecture, whether or not the plan that we design is successful. And so that's all huge. But one of the things that often people miss here is that the last part of this, of design justice, is that we challenge the privilege and power structures that use architecture and design as a tool of oppression. And so all that means is that we are players in a larger system. We are components of that system, and we can choose to act in service of harmful systems, or we can choose to challenge those systems and create new spaces where more people are served more justly. Simple as that. But every piece of architecture, every piece of plan should challenge a portion of a system that is harmful, if we can. So that's at the core of the work that we do. That means that our principles of practice have to honor the griot. It means that we have to recognize land and liberation. When I say honor the griot, a griot is a storyteller, the people on the block who have narratives and histories in that place. I used to call these the Miss Marys. My grandmother was a Miss Mary. So a Miss Mary, Miss Elizabeth. My nan was a Miss Mary. And what I mean by that is she knew every single young person and elder who walked down her block for 50 years, right? She knew every single person. And so in doing so, she had a vested history and a vested understanding of the block in ways that we can never have as researchers, as designers. We can't come into a block and in 3 months hope that we understand it in the same depth, right? So we should honor and rely on the narratives and storytelling of those people. Right? So I say that to acknowledge that everything stems from there. We recognize that the power that's built in place is a power that is honoring not only the griots, but other community members. We recognize that culture unto itself is both an evolutionary consideration and a revolutionary consideration, meaning it is the buildup, the accumulation of stories and circumstances over time, as well as the immediate conditions that people are dealing with. I'll hop around here a little bit, but one of the other ones, the two that I want you to kind of hold on to, recognize that form follows fiction. This is one that obviously plays off of a common architectural trope. But the idea that form, especially in marginalized communities, is a byproduct of the narratives and stories that people tell us, not necessarily the physicality of the architecture, in large part because in communities that have been marginalized over time, the architecture is not sustained in the same way, right? It's not financed, it's not developed in the same way. And so when cities neglect spaces, then the only things we have to hold on to are the stories that come from those spaces, or the stories that come from those places. So oftentimes form follows the fiction, it follows the narrative, it follows the story. And then the other one I wanted to just leave with before we move on is design as protest. I talk about this often, but the protest is to have an unyielding faith in the power and potential of a just society. It is about our collective hope for what a future might look like. And so when we think about design is indeed an act of faith in a future. It is an act of challenge to an existing condition. And if we see it as such, then we can take that as an opportunity to imagine just futures, to be radical in the work that we do moving forward. So in that, we ask ourselves these 5 core questions. I know it's a lot of text early on. You'll get over it, and then we'll get to some of the architecture. But I think it's important to hold on to some of these things, because the concepts are really what I think you take away from some of these presentations. So just broadly, we're talking about these 5 core questions all the time in every project we do. What are the power structures that that exist in our particular community? What are the injustices that result from that power structure? Who is directly and disproportionately impacted? How does that impact show up in the physical environment? And then ultimately, how do we address or think about new opportunities to challenge and change systems that exist on the ground? Can we shift those things? In that work, can we work from a position of outreach, where we are often looking to communicate ideas, especially in community? When I talk about the process and outcomes, this is where we think about the process. Do we just outreach with people? Do we think about engagement, where we grow from communication to feedback? There's a feedback loop, to a level of organizing, which allows us to mobilize and build power in those communities. I often say to our clients, what better way to build community, to build investment into your space, especially from a neighborhood, than to build this architecture, this space with that community. It doesn't take a lot of additional effort. It doesn't take a lot of additional time. It does take some coordination, and it does take us relieving ourselves of the notion that we have to have all the power all the time, right? Can we redistribute power in the process? That's what we ask ourselves to do. But in order to do that, we have to really understand what a system is. We have to really identify and deal with a system at its highest level. That means that when I talk about systems, I talk about the signal and the receiver. I talk about the fact that the three things that define a signal: pedagogy, policies, and procedures. They're constantly sending signals out to these receivers that say practice, projects, and people. And that back and forth is how we define our work. So in this, I would say, as a designer, we often focus on the projects and the practice more than anything else. But what if we opened up our purview a bit broader, and we started to look at procedures and policies a bit more? And we realized that those implications from the policies and procedures tell us how we practice. They tell us the type of architectures that have been produced in the world, and ultimately shape what we would produce moving forward. One of the questions I often ask people in these presentations is and I know it's a webinar, so I don't get response right now, but I'll play it out myself. So the policies themselves, if we think about redlining, we know that the policy around redlining did not specifically articulate Black and brown people as the subject of redlining. They called people undesirables, right? Within the procedure, they defined undesirables as Black and brown people, right? And so critically important to understand that as design professionals, whatever we're doing can address procedures as well as policies, but we have to know the difference in moving forward. And so that might mean that we change RFP structures. That might mean that we're heavily dealing with zoning laws. That might mean we're addressing HUD in different ways. All of that is ground setting so that our projects can be better off and they can serve more people. Okay, so before I'm going to do this, and then I'm going to get into some of the work that will show you some of these things on the back end. So one of the things that really allows us to understand this concept of construct is to really deep dive into what the difference between kind of status quo or injustice means all the way to liberation, what that entails. What it entails is first an acknowledgement of what injustice is. And really, injustice is just an imbalance of a system that denies equal distribution of power, access, resources, in an effort for one party to maintain power. That's what injustice is, right? And a system in and of itself attempts to recreate the same outputs over and over and over. Any system attempts to do that, whether it's your car, your bicycle, your house. Like all of those systems are supposed to do the same thing over and over and over again. They have fail safes, they have redundancies so that it can do the same thing over and over and over again. And so what that means is that injustice, once it's locked into a particular environment, is not dependent on singular individuals to maintain racist systems. It is dependent upon the structures being strong enough to maintain regardless of those individuals. That's the point, right? And so what we do is ask ourselves to move past equality, move towards equity, justice, and liberation. With liberation being the most intense version of this, seeking to repair for past injustices, to make fair in the present, to remove barriers to progress. And the most difficult for most people seems to be to affirmatively influence the future outcomes for those who have been historically marginalized, right? Harmed by any particular system. Okay, so why is that important? All of what I've just set up is a foundation, or it's a baseline, so that as you start to think about how it relates back to your architecture or to your design, your plans at the scale of cities, you recognize that these things are forces that are applied to a community. That community then shapes a culture as a result of it. And that culture then defines how we exist in the world. Now, it's critically important to understand that people in our society often conflate a lot of these things, whether it's race, nationality, ethnicity, culture, religion sometimes. And that makes it very difficult to understand, but we're going to focus on culture as a core here. But culture is the consequence of a prevailing collective condition and immediate individual circumstance. It is a collective coping mechanism and a necessary trauma response. So culture is a way for us to find the path of least resistance in a world that is actively in entropy, right? So in doing so, we deconstruct existing conditions and try to constantly create new prevailing conditions. This is something we can talk about later. This is a big whole thing, so we'll move on from that. But ultimately, if you hold nothing else, hold this set of constructs. If we're thinking about how to be anti-racist in this work, we're thinking about design justice, and we're thinking about a liberatory praxis, it requires at least these four things, at the very least. It requires us to think about narrative in the form of acknowledgement and representation of communities, specifically those who have been harmed in those particular communities. It requires us to think about the mutual aid of the architecture we put into the world. So what is our accountability to one another and our accountability to the communities we serve? It requires us to deconstruct and reconstruct or construct dismantled, to dismantle and recreate new spaces. And so systems of white supremacy, how do we deconstruct those ideologies and colonial mindsets and construct new worlds that are in service of justice? And then lastly, how do we future set? Is it possible to affirmatively influence the future outcomes that we are seeking through our work? Okay. So let me get to some of the architecture so I can show you what that looks like in practice. I got like 600 slides, so this depends on the timelines we get. But all right, let's pull to some of the small things, and then we'll work our way up. So first and foremost, what happens when we think about these things at the scale of individual or direct action? So direct action might mean that we want to do a design process that directly impacts communities who are harmed at an immediate scale. So this is an installation that we worked on with the DAP Collective, which takes on a temporary memorial site for those who have been murdered by police violence across the country. And it lets us kind of define and occupy space. Small project, but it's a collective effort. It's a quick effort, and it's a way for us to use our design skills to challenge particular systems. Another project that we worked on was called Lights Out. So Lights Out is a project post-Katrina that really sought to think about Lights Out is a project post-Katrina that was really trying to figure out the vacancy rates in New Orleans after a tremendous storm. There was about 50,000 vacant properties post-Hurricane Katrina, and sometime around 2014-15, there was still about 30 to 40 vacant properties still in the city. And so how do we actually think about a radical cultural process to bring light to those particular projects, to think about the collective narrative of those projects and put them into service back into service for the community itself. And so one of the things that we did was unpack what we were attempting to do, and then who do we address by way of that. So understanding that there's a difference between neighborhoods and communities was essential to that critique. Knowing that the neighborhood is a spatial and geographic boundary to place, and communities are the kind of spiritual, ideological, cultural presence of that space. Now they have an affinity to one another, but they are not the same thing. it's critical that we use precise words when we're talking about these things, and I'll tell you why. So as we started to dig into the process of Lights Out, we attempted to buy a property, and that one property was about $90,000 in underwater. It was a vacant property, and it required all of the things you see in this diagram in order to be put back into service. Right? So it took an awful lot to bring a house back online after Katrina, and it meant that there was a certain tax bracket of people who could afford these properties, which meant we were pushing other folks out even more so from returning. Okay? So we talked to hundreds and hundreds of people. We organized community members. We worked with young people to design yard signs. We ran for mayor and we ran for president in 2017. And we ran on the platform of Black Land Matters, right? We really talked about how we think about development without displacement and the like. Yes. Okay. And then we use the language of our communities, the kind of cultural language of our community. We went from place to place with second lines and really started to activate neighborhoods through that particular tool. So this was an engagement tool, but it was also a way for us to survey properties across the city, right? To dance, to play music, to mourn, to place art on, and to celebrate our neighborhoods, to tell the stories of these buildings, of the lives of the people who lived in these buildings prior to dereliction, right? Again, working with young people to create billboards and tell stories, to hold teach-ins, and to train people. We held teach-ins underneath these billboards for 12 months, for a full year. Every month we had a different billboard, right? And you might say, well, this is not architecture. We got this a lot when we first started. This is not architecture, but this is the ground setting, right? I think you have to remediate a land before you're often able to do that work in real ways. And it takes a lot longer. It takes a lot more time. But these are every bit as meaningful in terms of interactions. It builds community interaction, but it also allows you to understand the landscape in a way that you would not be able to otherwise. So here's a planning process. So once we closed out Lights Out, we worked on a project you may have seen. A lot of folks across the country started to really work on the removal of racism monuments across the South, across actually the nation, actually globally. But as a part of that process, we have to ask ourselves, what was next in our landscape, right? When you tear down racist monuments, how do you not leave a void so that people, how do you not leave a void in public space and create something that identifies itself with the stories and narratives of the people of the city? And so that's what we did. We acknowledged that context of those who are on the wrong side of history, those who are on the right side of history, and how do you continue to really open yourselves up to what a new landscape might look like after 150 years of silent violence hovering over the city. And so we created a project called Paper Monuments, which is a citywide planning process that involved us asking the question, can you imagine what new monuments to New Orleans looks like? So we created a project framework that leveraged the systems of our city, whether that's transit, our civic institutions, libraries, bus stops, so on and so forth, and museums and schools and public spaces. We reclaimed the public spaces that were, again, we reclaimed as like a set of plants on a toxic land, right? The ability to, again, remediate the soil We did that by telling stories and trying to reset what people's view of a particular location is, and reassociate it with the stories of people of place rather than the stories of enslavers, right? We asked 10,000 people to join us in that conversation and to do it publicly, to write proposals for what they would want to see in public space, to tell us about what's important about our culture, about our families, about the legacy of this city, about the women who helped anchor this city. And we put that back into the world. So again, all of this as a planning process. How do you actually communicate as a citywide dialogue? We put it back in the street as is, as people sketched it, as people wrote it. And we worked with authors, more than 35 authors, more than 50 artists, to create a series of posters to contemporize the stories and narratives of our history, with an effort to defocus individuals and to honor the larger collective of people, places, events, and movements. And so that's what we did. We used every weekend as a tool to have community members come out and wheat paste with us to tell these stories across the city, to go out and hang posters. This is what we called framing history. So these were posters that were put on boards and placed adjacent to locations where these actual events happened. And so they were kind of stumble upon efforts where people walked up. Sometimes they were engaged in crass ways. Sometimes they were painted over. But one of the things that we wanted to get out of this storytelling effort was to say, this is how history is often treated, right? It is subject to the weather. It is subject to history. It's subject to people. But we cover up our stories in various ways. And they can often be forgotten. And so we have to be cognizant of that. And then lastly, we talked about representation. How do we represent these things in physical space and bring them to bear? So these are a series of slides that start to take some of the proposals from people, whether it's lighthearted, a city of water, rethinking our ecological conditions on land in the city of New Orleans, playful, where we talk about a gramophone sitting on the pedestal of a former enslaver in Robert E. Lee that plays New Orleans music, or something more somber, where we talk about the lives of enslaved Africans who were brought to shore here in New Orleans as stolen spirits, and honoring them as human beings, not as enslaved people, right? All of these and many, many more opportunities to reflect the hundreds of different stories in a bunch of different ways across the cityscape. And we did this over and over and over again in physical ways, in digital ways, and use that as a tool to kind of continue conversations. This is one of the beautiful pieces that we had by Lydia Stein, who made this wonderful kind of gold set of sunflower seeds that are about 22 feet tall, pretty enormous. But the reflection here was that post-Katrina, the waters carried sunflower seeds all across the city, and you started to see sunflowers grow and sprout out of the most random places in the city, out of refrigerators and on streetscapes and on the top of the highway, and so you saw this water like kind of carry life, and life being resistant to even the most harmful of harms, and so this was a symbol of that. Katrina. So all of that to say that the reports that we produced out of the end of this, the kind of planning report, helped to shape the New Orleans naming commission, which is renaming street signs, which is rethinking what the new monumentality of the city will be moving forward. And so if you want to check out Paper Monuments, please go to papermonuments.org and you'll be able to see so much of this work. And then lastly, I will talk to you a little bit about a project called the Claiborne Innovation District. So in 2015, the city wanted to kind of rethink what happened underneath the Claiborne highway. Back in 1972, Claiborne Avenue design team was a series of architects and activists by Rudy Lombard and a few other local architects who really wanted to challenge this highway that had cut through 10 years before, right? And what it meant for a highway to come through, to disaggregate, to harm a Black community, historically one of the most thriving Black communities in the country, and to limit its health, wealth, economic, educational outcomes for the next 50 years, right? That's the type of suppression a highway cutting through a neighborhood does. And so this, we picked up on the shoulders of giants to talk about and bring forth and try to make real their ideas from 50 years ago. So the Claiborne Cultural Innovation District was just that. It was a way for us to talk to folks in green infrastructure, to our elders in the community, to artists in the community, to business folks, to youth, and to reflect those comments and that commentary into the architecture, to think about the stories that they wanted to tell, the sketches that we brought forth in those conversations, and to translate them into an architecture that allowed for marketplaces to work underneath the highway as they currently do, but to formalize that a bit more, to make sure that there is an acknowledgement that 90 to 95% of Black businesses in the city are 1 to 3 people throughout the entirety of their existence, meaning they're not going to have the same relationship to brick and mortar buildings, right? So we had to rethink the type of spaces that we could allocate for them because we weren't going to put them in buildings that were going to have an increase in taxes year over year, and the overall cost would be exponential for them. So we redesigned and thought about what a market booth might look like that still gave them the essence of a physical space, but did not require all of the maintenance. We reclad and rethought about recladding the underneath of the highway to talk with our artists, talk about how they want to interact in this space, what kind of stories they want to tell and how they might want to tell them. And how do we maintain the space to preserve the kind of cultural condition that currently exists, which means second lines that walk through St. Joseph's Night that come through and down the highway, and allow for that to still be a celebration. And especially acknowledging how the potential futures of youth would apply to a space like this. And then lastly, how do we reflect on our elders? How do we create monuments to those who have been with us and have continued to hold our stories in the past? So that is the kind of total of the couple projects. I will leave you with this. Claiborne Cultural Innovation District, we just pulled a couple $1 million to officially do the first leg, first 2 blocks of this project. So over the next 2 years, you'll start to see the design and construction of the innovation district. But that's a long-term process. I mean, that's one of the things that we have to be clear about with design justice, that often takes a longer period because it is a community conversation, and communities are unwieldy, but brilliant. So I'll pause there because I think I've taken up enough time for us to have a legitimate conversation here. But thank you for your time and attention, and yeah, let's talk.
Thank you so much. There's so much to unpack there, and really inspiring design. And I just want to hand things off to Nadia Anderson, who will moderate the discussion with students.
Okay, thanks, Blaine. And thank you, Brian. That was really inspiring. And I was hitting my screenshot. I know we have recordings of these, but I think I might need some of your words, excuse me, even sooner than that. I promise I won't plagiarize. So let's see, why don't we start with, oh boy, how about Mary Grayson? Would you like to start us off?
Absolutely can. Thank you so much for that lecture. It was awesome. Especially learning about justice design and equitable design, and knowing that community is such an important part. And thank you for talking about the Paper Monuments project. That project's really interesting. And I know it's so important. And I kind of wanted to ask you, knowing that you talked about that process of the community and how lengthy it can be, what's the ongoing process and relationship, after the fact? Like, what is the impact? How can you measure, maybe not like necessarily the success, but how can you measure that community engagement, and where do you see those relationships in the process going?
So let me just make sure I understand. So you're asking, like, how do we measure the impact, or well, not measure, but how do we kind of track the impact that communities bring to a project over time?
Right.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
how that relationship, after the fact, how that can process will keep going in
How is it
that
maintained?
engagement.
Yeah, so there's a couple things that are aligned with that, because again, we acknowledge that sorry, glitch there happened. I don't know what something happened on my end. Apologies. So I guess what I would say is that, we note that the partners that we bring into the project, the partners that we go into a project with, whether that's a client, a developer, an institution, has to have similar core values in the project. So we are only with the project for a certain amount of time, and so they've got to be willing to carry a lot of the core concepts that we build together into the future. So that's one thing. That also means that the architecture requires institutions to alter and adjust their policies and procedures to account for the structure that they're trying to create. So if someone says, we're working on a library presently, and they might say, well, we want people to feel more welcome, and we want them to be able to express their culture, but no food in the library, and you got to be quiet. That's going to lose out eventually, right? No matter what design we make, right? So that's huge. The other way is that for every single project that we do, we hire what we call community design advocates. So a community design advocate is a community member, and a activist, an advocate themselves that is vested in the future of a particular place and wants to be a part of the design team. So we hire those folks on. It can be 5 people, it can be 10 people. And what they do is they organize their community, right? So we talk with them, they go spread that information and talk to various community members, and then we all kind of come back and digest that information. And so again, limiting the power that we have, redistributing that power to community members, and then allowing that to exist into the world beyond. That keeps it connected.
Awesome. Thank you.
There's a ton of data, like the back end, we have just because we qualify every single conversation that comes in. And so, there might be 50,000, 60,000 comments, and we track that, and then we publish it. We make a design justice set, an architectural set that goes into the document set, and it has every comment that came out during the process.
Yeah, I can imagine how much data you get from that.
Yeah.
And I think that community engagement is really important and integral into continuing forward. And I have one more question. You kind of talked about it in the first step of being a partnership, and knowing that Colloqate really highlights that the architect is a partner with the client or the developer, whomever the community, and not necessarily just a tool, just to share that power together. How long is that process where you kind of figure out if you will be good partners together?
I mean, I think there's a part of understanding the principles of design justice better allows you to make better decisions about your partnerships fairly quickly. There's language that people use that leans towards an abusive partnership or leans towards someone who's willing to aim in the right directions. And so for us now, it's very easy. It used to take us a long time because we wanted to, I mean, I think we still want to give people the benefit of the doubt and assume good intentions. But oftentimes, sometimes people just aren't ready yet. And so we need a different relationship than a project relationship. We might need a relationship that is actively training, right? So we might need to go in and just train this project, and maybe next project will join you, but they have to prime themselves to be ready to do that type of work.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you for asking.
Fantastic. Let's see, I think, let's go to Michaela next.
Again, like, thank you so much. It was such an interesting conversation. I have like a page full of notes and thoughts and ideas and questions. But kind of going off of a question that was asked in like the chat where it's talking about like time. I'm wondering how the explanation works towards community members, where it's like these really great ideas are coming out of the design process, but like they can't necessarily happen in the next week, month. Like how is that explanation? Like how is that given?
Yeah. How do you talk to people about, how do we talk to people about the timelines of projects? So a couple things. One is that we try not to talk to clients to community members about precise architectural details, right? Things that have we're not asking people about carpet samples or brick colors, or we're talking about experiences. And so when we talk about the creation of an experience, the timeline is when the building gets done. It's not about, it doesn't follow the same timeline as the phases of an architectural project. And so we think about and we show them this timeline that is really dependent on the work that they've already done. A lot of the people that we bring in as CDAs, there is this deep acknowledgement that they are already activists, they are already advocates in their community, they're already fighting for all of these things. Our job is to amplify that towards a particular project for a small period of time, and then for you, the advocate, and the institution to continue fighting moving forward, right, towards that end. So really the opportunity there is to lay out a timeline that does not confine itself to the project itself, but acknowledges a deep, unabashed history of working communities prior to, and a pathway for both the institution and the organizers to kind of continue off and on into the future.
And then the next part of that question is more on the side of like art washing. Like what happens, or I guess like how, as in this position, how are you able to kind of like prevent / mediate the ability that art has to kind of encourage people to like move in and potentially gentrify an area?
Yeah, so this is, when I talked about understanding the kind of larger systems at hand, it means that an art project is not the thing that makes people come into a neighborhood. It may be a final priming, but there are 50 other things that have already primed that community to move forward in a particular way. Now, it might be the last little domino, but it is oftentimes the one that it's a scapegoat for a capitalist system that is harmful prior to. So I think that the big thing is, when I talked about we have to acknowledge the policies and procedures that exist that create a particular type of space. When we go through a process, we can't just show a building. We actually have to go in and figure out what policies are going to be harmful moving forward and address those, whether that's in the document set, whether that's, publicly in articles, but it has to be codified in some capacity, right? And so I don't know that there's an immediate way for any one singular thing to prevent a push towards gentrification, but I do think that it is our obligation in every project to push back against those potentialities as a matter of course. And then the other thing I would say, just lastly, like when we talk about gentrification, we are often talking about, because this is a thing that comes up in literally every project we've ever done, and every community meeting I've ever been in. The primary word is gentrification, and most people don't. I ask people, what do you think gentrification is? And I think most people don't actually know what gentrification is, and so we define it through the lens of gentrification is the process of dying scaled up from the human being to the neighborhood, right? It is a transformative process, but it is not a singular process. It means that it takes a very long time. There are 14,000 ways that you can code a human body that as to die, right? And there's a whole bunch of processes for each single one of those codes, right? But for a neighborhood, it's one thing. It's just gentrification. So we, as an understanding of systems, as a collectives, as a profession, have to be better at understanding all of the ways in which neighborhoods transition, all of the ways in which neighborhoods change, die, morph, reincarnate. And then we can stop isolating art or, affordable housing or, a mall or whatever the thing is as the singular thing that pushed us over into gentrification. It is a collection and it's a combinatorial system that we have to address prior to. I was a little long-winded, but you get the point.
Yeah, no, that was a good way to put it. So we also have some questions from Mackenzie.
So kind of thinking about like your idea of like Black culture and like the idea of form follows fiction, how does your design with social justice relate to like the creation of like Black spaces, as well as the idea of like continuing to keep Black identities as, you're beginning to transform and change spaces?
Wonderful. Okay, so the entirety of my work is centered on Black space. I think for me, as a Black man, it is the purview and view that I can view the world. It's the only way I can view the world. And so when we think about space, it's critical. I think during the presentation I mentioned, we often conflate race, ethnicity, culture, all of these other things, right? And what I try to be clear about in our work is that we are, I'll just say this, when white people think about Blackness, they see it through the lens of race. When Black people think about Blackness, we see it through the lens of our culture. We see it through, those stories, like we see the cultural condition of Blackness. And that's how I think I see our work as well, is through the many different pathways and narratives and storylines that shape a Blackness in space. And I also see all of the forces that shape our response to the world, right? I often point to the fact that here in New Orleans, a second line is an amazing thing. If people come to New Orleans, they might dance in the streets. We play music, we dance in for 4 hours in the middle of the streets. But if you didn't know that Black people could not bury their dead in New Orleans, if you didn't know that we had to raise money to put people in the ground in New Orleans, then you would just experience the kind of superficial joy of that moment, not the pain, the strife, the struggle, the patterns that had to be created as a byproduct of oppression in our spaces. So what I attempt to bring to our work is a deep assessment of the cultural pattern, the cultural norms that have oppressed Black people for generations, and by doing so, hopefully, when we talk about housing, we talk about ending the carceral state right? And abolishing prisons and jails. While I view that through a lens of Blackness and the kind of harms that have been put on Blackness, that also means that it supports those who are detained from, who are migrating from the South, right? Because those same prisons that were developed to harm Black people are harming other people. Right. So that's the thing that I implore our organization, or I think other people to do, is to not focus on the racialized condition of Blackness, but the culturalized condition of Blackness and all of the forces that shape those patterns. Because that way we are going to be focused on the justice. We're going to be focused on equity. We're not going to be focused on diversity or inclusion, right? That's what JEDI means, right? It's justice and equity before diversity and inclusion. Diversity and inclusion are outcomes. So that's our job, is to focus on justice. And it's me specifically, I focus on the justice for Black people, and that should hopefully continue to spread.
Great. Okay, thank you. Let's see. I'm going to take advantage of my location to ask a question of my own that I think builds on some of this. It's a big question. I wonder if you could speak to the role of capitalism, particularly in the US, with respect to the marginalization of people of color and the sort of domination or supremacy of white culture, and how, as architects, and the way that architects typically participate in this system, or urban designers or whatever, how do we think about our role and how we might counter that?
Yeah. I mean, I think the Western world is built off of exploitation of labor as a means to generate capital, right? Like it's our entire country is only has power off of the extracted labor of Black and brown people, and so I don't think capitalism can really thrive without the exploitation of some party that is its point to some extent. And so from a architectural position, it's hard to say, but I think that generally, there's a slide that I have in there that talks about the fact that since we are not the power source oftentimes in the process, we are conduits to power. We can end up being conduits to malicious power as easily as good power, right? And so since capitalism itself drives a lot of this, the monetary return on investment drives a lot of this work, we can tend towards malice, right? Whether that's through, again, something so subtle as creating benches that have hostile architecture built through them, or like those things are not just to be mean, they're somewhat to protect someone's investment, right? Like that's the intention. And so we create all these tools. And so I think it's like fighting those. For us, it is really about fighting those implementations of hostility in the environment that are solely created to protect capital, and then to reshape the underlying equations that output a certain set of outcomes. And so the other one I always point to is affordable housing, or the kind of the ideal American household of, 2 kids, a dog, a white picket fence, and whatever. Like that idea is driven by kind of a capitalist kind of concentration. And so when we talk about affordable housing, instead of thinking about the area median income, why don't we think about the area median in wealth? So we acknowledge that the extraction of capital over time has impacted Black and brown bodies far more, right? So we know that, well, yes, Black women make 61% on the dollar to a white man as a matter of income, but Black people are aiming at $0 by 2025 in terms of overall wealth. Right? $0. We're 1 to 17 right now. In 1937, we were 1 to 3 to white families in terms of overall wealth. We're 1 to 17 right now. That's insane. And so because we never really think more broadly about those systems, we try to play within the bounds of what capitalism provides for us. And I think ultimately as designers, if we could take one step back and just look at what the system is telling us to do, I think we can challenge it a bit more.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Do we have a couple questions in the chat? Do we still have time for some?
Yeah, I think Sekou asked one question, if you have a moment for that, Bryan.
Yeah, I think, and I'm going to go, I think he actually asked two. I think the second one sort of about time was kind of covered by Michaela's, but his first question was, now that we're about 18 months into the life of the DAP collective post George Floyd, how have your perceptions of this initiative changed? How is it being received differently now than it might have been 12 months ago? And just for the sake of the audience, you might want to explain what the DAP collective is.
Yeah. So the DAP Collective is a group of BIPOC designers from across the country of all ages who are actively seeking to challenge the systems of oppression that are using architecture as a tool, right? That is the kind of preamble to that. DAP Collective was started in 2020, but DAP was created in 2015, designed to protest as a series of workshops that we did across the country. I think to answer that specific question, the DAP Collective, to some extent, was a space of healing, as much as it was a space to challenge external forces. I think over the last 2 years, the 200 plus people who have been involved have found a way to reconfigure their professional trajectories, their academic trajectories, all in service of kind of a more just built environment. I think initially, what you would have expected to happen after George Floyd died was a lot of people put up black squares and they made a lot of promises and they didn't keep a lot of those promises. And I think today we see still a strong core, but a core of people who are invested in the larger premise of design justice. And so while it's not the same amount of people, we don't have, I think we had 1,300 people show up to our first national call. We have maybe 250 now, significant drop off, but still a good core. So the changes is critical, but I also think that we have done a lot of direct action, and so the output is less about architects these days. And I think that's what I think is critical. It moved from a position of let's bring in a bunch of designers and let's make sure that the designers themselves are refocused on how to engage the world from a perspective of design justice. But we've done direct actions with organizers on the ground in Philly who were mace bombed by the police in 2017, with the kind of Chicago police violence activists on the ground in Chicago. And so I think that the most distinct change is going from looking and talking to a bunch of architects to looking and talking to a bunch of organizers and activists. And I'm very proud of that as a trajectory. Thanks for that question.
Yeah.
I don't see you, Sekou, but what's up, man?
Okay, so we've got one more, and I'm going to try to summarize this a little bit. This is also, so I think, a little bit more specific, but follows on what I was asking about capitalism. So Joseph Gordon is asking if there is a way for designers to work with, I'm going to say, let's see, we've got developers, those with power and money, the private sector, as opposed to the public sector, as a way of addressing issues of injustice. And also he asks that, money and access to it seems to be the real problem. So could this kind of partnership, what could you envision that kind of a partnership? Or how it would work?
Yeah, no. No, it probably doesn't work. Not in my experience, I will say. What I know from my experience is that all of the developers that we work with are always, in all instances, even if they have the good of Christ in their heart, they are devoted to a bottom line. They're devoted to $1, and the only thing that changes that is directives by those who approve the work that they do. So when I work for the city here in New Orleans, the only thing that changed the outputs was changing the way we wrote RFPs, like literally going in and changing the policies, changing the way that we ask for proposals and qualifications. Because if you change it just ever so slightly, it requires developers to come in, it requires architects to come in with a slightly different attitude. And it will wipe away the developers and designers who don't want to do good, who only want to do a certain type of work. And so I guess maybe the caveat is yes, but they have to be puppeted by a city that is willing to fight for its people, right? A city who can write an RFP and template design that requires them to do better, that requires them to do precisely what you're asking, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Could not agree with you more on that.
Yeah.
Let's see. So we've also got, and Joseph says, yeah, I don't know if you see that. Totally makes sense. Sadly, thank you.
Yeah.
And so Alex Cabral, who's our runs our fabrication lab, is asking, how would you encourage our students to be more activist through their studio work?
Yes. So I think the same rules apply. You still have to have a set of design decisions that are backed up by, that are backed up in some capacity. But if it's backed up by people's voice, that means you got to go talk to people. So if you're actually working on a studio project that has a real site, it's not on Mars, or like you're here, you're grounded, then go talk to people. And I know that's not what your studios often ask you to do, but that kind of research or that kind of quality engagement is more than enough to usually invest for your professors to appreciate the fact that you've gone out and done more, but also it will make your work more rich because it is directly divined by those sets of conversations. And then the other thing is like push your professors, push your teachers, push your deans, push your directors to encourage real people to come in and be on your crits. Our studio last year, we did a Black New Deal studio, and 2/3 of the crits were people from the city. It was the mayor of the city. It was people from the corner store. It was people who worked at the city or worked in a nonprofit. Like those are the people who these designs impact, and their opinions are the ones that actually matter. And that's not to say that all of us who have done many years of this work don't have a critical eye for it, but our critical eye can be focused on the architecture, and we can allow for community members to tell you how this thing would change their life. Can you make the greatest impact? Can you allow for people to learn more through that work? So when you think about your studio work, think about its life after. I am so disheartened by some of the work that I did when I was younger that does not have a life now. But I look back on the 2 or 3 projects when I got a little older and I said, I want this work to exist in the world. I can still use it today, right? I could still use some of those things today. So if you can create work that ends up as a little tool for someone else to learn something, that unpacks a system, that sheds light on how a neighborhood might be able to grow a little bit more towards justice, do that, and you'll be able to live with yourself, and potentially your professors will appreciate that more as well. I know I would. So thank you for that question.
Great. Thank you so much. I think we're beyond time here. It's been such a rich and enriching conversation, Bryan. Thank you so much. Just some closing comments, if I may. As I was listening to your lecture, I'm thinking, you know, one hopes that a lecture would inform and inspire, right? That's something that we hope for, and sometimes that happens. A taller order to me is if a lecture fundamentally enlightens, and you have done that for me. And I'm thinking, what is a true kind of the pure essence of an educational experience? And that's what I feel like I've had when education is at its best. I mean, obviously your work can be a whole course, it can be a whole curriculum, right? Because for me, you have done such a wonderful job in encapsulating and explaining the how of design justice. I think the why is something we have to keep telling, right? We have to keep telling the why, but the how is something we're all extremely interested in. I also appreciate the focus on future visioning, right? We have to dismantle these Confederate monuments, but the emphasis on what stories are we going to tell, right? How are we going to shape our future cities is so important. One final point I would offer too is that this field is not only, has not only a deep history of racism and many kinds of injustice, but also egotism, right? And I really appreciate how you and your leadership show a model for how to be an architect, how to democratize the design process, how to include and empower communities. I think at one point you called communities brilliant. And how often do we, that's wonderful. How often do we hear architects saying that, right? And to demonstrate true civic leadership. So you've fundamentally inspired me today, and I really appreciate your work. I'd love for us to follow you in this work, partner with you perhaps in this work. There's a lot of work to do, but a lot of inspiration you've given us today.
Thank you so much. I'll hold you to that. We'll talk soon about stuff. All right.
Great. Great. Thank you, students, Mary Grayson, Michaela McKenzie, for your thoughtful, insightful questions and comments. To Nadia for also yours as well, and for moderating. To Peter and Caddy for your great job with this lecture series, and Emily as well for support, and to LS3P for your sponsorship of this lecture today, as well as AIA Charlotte. So everyone have a wonderful, incredible afternoon and weekend. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone. Take it easy. Bye.
Thank you so much.